There is a formula that repeats in American financial history. 5 steps. They never change. Step 1. Build an institution for people who have no other options. Step 2. Borrow the aura of protection until those people trust you. Step 3. Once the deposits arrive, change the rules where depositors can't see. Step 4. Move the money into your own pockets and your own projects. Step 5. When the losses surface, find someone else to wear the blame. On the 3rd of March 1865, Congress created a bank for freed people, men and women, newly released from slavery, newly paid for their labor, and newly told that the future could belong to them. It was called the Freedmen's Savings and Trust Company. In public language, it sounded like a promise. A safe place to deposit wages, a ladder into citizenship, a bridge from emancipation to security. The bank's founding was presented alongside sweeping post-war commitments, and for many depositors it felt like the first proof that the government meant what it said. The design looked simple. 4 million people had just been freed. Many had never been permitted to own anything at all. Not a house, not a title, not even their own names in official records. A bank account, in that context, was not merely a financial product. It was a receipt that you existed. It was a small legal shelter where yesterday's property could become today's person with savings. The original charter promised safety through restraint. Deposits were to be placed only in conservative instruments, government securities, treasury notes, the kinds of assets that do not evaporate just because rumors ripple through markets. In plain terms, no gambling with people's first wages, no turning their pennies into someone else's leverage, no loans, just custody, protection, time. But if you read the fine print, the cracks were already there. Governance was concentrated in a board of trustees with enormous discretion and little personal risk. Depositors had no real mechanism to punish mismanagement. There were no sharp teeth in the law, no personal liability, no automatic penalties, no straightforward way for the people whose money was at stake to force accountability. The bank could look like a public guarantee while operating like a private club. Then the symbol that held the promise together disappeared. Abraham Lincoln signed the charter, and weeks later he was dead. The face that had made the institution feel governmental was gone, and the bank, still wrapped in official imagery, remained vulnerable in ways depositors could not easily see. Freed people trusted it anyway. Why wouldn't they? The bank's public messaging leaned hard on the appearance of legitimacy. The passbook handed to each depositor didn't read like a contract between equals. It read like reassurance. The bank's promotional language spoke of benevolence, of best friends, of guardianship. For people emerging from a system built on theft, the possibility of a safe vault with official-looking endorsements carried a force that is hard to exaggerate. So they deposited. Week after week, dollar by dollar. Present comfort traded for a future they had only just been allowed to imagine. Soldiers deposited military pay. Churches and mutual aid societies pooled contributions. Families saved wages from the first jobs they could choose for themselves. Within a few years, branches spread across states and cities, and tens of thousands of accounts opened. Deposits accumulated into sums that, in modern purchasing power, would rival large institutional funds built not by a handful of wealthy patrons but by small sacrifices multiplied at massive scale. Look closer, and you see the human detail beneath the statistics. In Richmond, Virginia, a father came with his wife and children, and opened accounts that recorded not only money but identity. Full name, place of birth, residence, occupation, names of relatives. The bank required this information for administrative reasons. But the effect was profound. For many formerly enslaved depositors, these registers captured the first official appearance of their family as a family, not as inventory, not as a line item on someone else's ledger, but as people tied to one another by names. That detail matters because the bank did 2 things at once. It held deposits, and it produced an archive. The surviving registers preserve hundreds of thousands of names and relationships across multiple branches. For genealogists and descendants, those pages can be the difference between a severed lineage and a traceable one. The institution that would later destroy savings also preserved identity, an accidental monument created by bureaucracy, not by kindness. Now move to the date that functions like a hinge, the 2nd of May, 1870. If you want the moment when the money became vulnerable, start there. On that day, Congress amended the charter. The original rules had effectively locked deposits into the safest instruments the nation could offer. The amendment opened a door. The bank could now place a large portion of deposits into loans and real estate investments. The safe vault was quietly converted into a machine for risk. The change did not arrive with matching oversight. No surge of examiners. No new penalties. No requirement that trustees post personal security. Just a loosened rule and a widened channel. Depositors, the people who had been barred from owning property months earlier, were not brought into the room where this was decided. They learned nothing of the new risk. They kept lining up, passbooks in hand, believing the same promise they had believed last week. Once the rules shifted, the rest of the formula could run. Money that should have sat in government securities began to circulate through deals that benefited the men directing the bank. Deposits were parked in friendly institutions, earning terms that shaved value from depositors while supplying capital to insiders. Loans flowed into speculative enterprises, grand construction, railroads, and projects whose paper looked respectable until it didn't. The bank built a lavish headquarters, a physical monument to respectability, while its balance sheet hollowed out. The building said strength. The book said fiction. And a sharper cruelty surfaced in the lending itself. The people whose deposits funded the machine did not receive the same access to credit. Black depositors who tried to borrow encountered stricter collateral demands than the white men drawing money out through insider loans and connected ventures. In other words, freed people funded risk they were not permitted to benefit from. They were the savings account, not the borrower. The cow, not the milk. By 1873, the rot was deep. A large share of loans were overdue. Cash on hand shrank. The bank's security was no longer security. It was exposure dressed as prudence. Then the wider economy cracked. In September 1873, a major investment house tied to railroad speculation failed, triggering panic and cascading bankruptcies across the country. The crash became the public explanation, the convenient narrative that allows Step 4 to hide behind Step 5. Banks fail, people said. The panic destroyed thousands of businesses. True. But this was not simply a market failure. The original charter had made catastrophic loss difficult precisely because government securities do not vanish in a panic. For the bank's deposits to be threatened, someone had to change the rules. Someone had to move the money from safe instruments into speculative ones. Someone had to lend it into projects that served private interests. That is not an unavoidable storm. That is a choice made before the weather turned. By early 1874, the trustees understood the institution was dying. They had watched it decay for months, and their solution was not confession, not restitution, not a warning to depositors still trusting the passbooks. Their solution was resignation, and the installation of a figure whose reputation could absorb the blast. Frederick Douglass. Think about the strategy. Douglass was among the most recognizable black leaders in America. A former enslaved man who had become an orator, writer, abolitionist, and moral authority. He was not merely famous, he was trusted. If you needed to calm depositors, if you needed the public to look somewhere other than the trustees' hands, you could hardly pick a more powerful symbol. Douglass walked into the bank's splendid headquarters and saw grandeur that looked like solvency. He invested his own money, and then he opened the books. What he found, by his own later descriptions, was a corpse. Far more in loans than deposits. Debts unlikely ever to be repaid. Almost no cash to meet withdrawals. He urged authorities to shut it down. He lasted only weeks. Long enough for his name to become attached to the collapse and short enough that he could not remake a structure already ruined. On the 29th of June 1874, the bank closed. Tens of thousands of depositors faced losses. For many families, the savings represented years of discipline under harsh conditions, money accumulated from the first wages they had ever legally earned. Losing it was not like losing a speculative bet. It was like losing the first proof that freedom could be translated into something tangible and protected. The aftermath followed the remaining steps of the formula. Investigations spoke of wrongdoing. Reports recommended consequences. And yet prosecutions did not arrive for the powerful men who engineered the shift. Meanwhile, in Congress, proposals to reimburse depositors rose and fell for decades, repeatedly blocked. Time did the quiet work that injustice loves. As years pass, Victims die. Records fade from public memory, and the lack of remedy becomes normalized. Eventually, officials declared the remaining assets depleted. Case closed. But the story never really closed, because the loss was not only financial, it was relational. It trained people through pain to doubt institutions that claim to serve them. It taught families that official seals can be costumes, that safety can be marketing, that rules can be rewritten without notice, and that when the bill comes due, it will not arrive at the doors of the men who benefited. That is why the most haunting artifact of the Freedmen's Bank is not the brownstone building that once stood in Washington, D.C. Buildings can be renamed. Plaques can be mounted. But a plaque does not restore trust. The haunting artifact is the register. Hundreds of thousands of names. Names written down by people who had been deliberately erased from the record. Names of spouses and children. Of parents and siblings separated and reunited. Of birthplaces and residences. Of lives trying to stitch themselves back together after a system designed to rip them apart. The bank demanded the information because it needed administrative certainty, heirs, identity, claims. The result is an archive that outlived the money. So we are left with the central contradiction. The institution that took deposits helped preserve identity, and the people whose identities it preserved did not receive justice for the theft. If you want to understand modern distrust in financial systems, don't treat it like a mystery that appeared from nowhere. Distrust is not a cultural defect. It is a historical response. It is the memory of rules changed behind closed doors. It is the memory of respectable buildings, financed by someone else's sacrifice. It is the memory of being told, "This is safe," and learning the sentence was never enforced. And if you want to measure the cost, don't start with dollars alone. Start with what the money was meant to buy. Stability, inheritance, land, education, the ability to say to a child, "This is yours." When that first bridge into the formal economy collapsed, it didn't just drain accounts, it injured the meaning of the account itself. Maybe someone will argue that the Freedmen's Bank was merely one tragedy among many in a volatile era. Maybe the Charter Amendment was just bad policy. Maybe installing Douglas was desperation rather than strategy. Maybe the blocked reimbursements were simply politics. But when the people who rewrote the rules are the same people positioned to benefit from the new rules, coincidence stops being convincing. When oversight remains thin, even as risk increases, negligence begins to look like permission. When accountability evaporates, and a symbolic figure is placed at the front of a collapsing institution, the narrative begins to resemble choreography. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Create a refuge for the vulnerable. Win trust with official language and borrowed legitimacy. Change the rules out of sight. Take the money. Blame the crash. Blame the panic. Blame the figurehead. Leave the victims with a lesson that will outlast the headlines. And yet, the depositors' names endure. In archives and digitized collections. In searchable databases. In family histories that slavery tried to erase. The men who siphoned value into their own ventures are footnotes. The people who built the savings one paycheck at a time are the record. That record is evidence. It asks a question as sharp now as it was then. Are we willing to follow where the names lead toward accountability and repair? Or will we keep repeating the trustee's final move? Take the deposits and walk away. Today, researchers sometimes describe the trust gap in banking as if it were an attitude problem. But attitudes are shaped by outcomes. A community that watched a federally chartered institution invite its wages, rewrite its own guardrails, and then deny remedy for generations learned irrational skepticism. Trust is not restored by slogans. It is restored by enforceable rules, transparent governance, and consequences that reach the powerful as surely as they reach the powerless.